Tota pulchra es Maria.
Tota pulchra es Maria, et macula originalis non est in te, et macula originalis non est in te. Tu gloria Jerusalem, tu letitia Israel, tu honorificentia populi nostri, tu advocata peccatorum. O Maria, O Maria, Virgo prudentissima, Virgo clementissima, ora pro nobis intercede pro nobis ad Dominum Iesum Christum.
When I told people that I was going to spend my sabbatical at a Trappist monastery, I was met with a variety of responses. Some surprise, some curiosity, some people really thinking about how I was going to get away from the world and have a chance to be productive and get some work done. And productivity really wasn't on my radar at the time. I was feeling pretty burnt out. I was really looking forward to engaging in a different way of living, different way of approaching being. The idea of getting away is, I think, somewhat incorrect. The life of a solitary, a monastic, is not one of retreating from the world or escaping it, but engaging with it in a more meaningful and deep way. In a sense, if it's retreating from anything, it's the idea that we can achieve union and connection through the kinds of distractions that we surround ourselves with in our day-to-day existence. And so it's a radical act against that kind of mindset, that mentality. What I noticed most about it was the kind of rhythmic quality that it takes on, and how entering into that rhythmic space had a profound effect on how I experienced the world and how I experienced my place in it. And that's really what I want to talk with you about, through talking kind of through the rhythm of the monastic day. But before I do that, excuse me, it's really worth explaining exactly what monastic life is like and where monasticism came from. So monasticism really, dates back to the early, very beginnings of the church, around the same time that people were trying to form together and figure out exactly what the church was going to be. There were those who felt that created a separation, a degree of stricture around connection to the divine. And so they left the cities and they went into the wilderness and they lived in caves and they contemplated and they worked and they lived very simple lives. And over time they began to band together, because you can imagine that's a difficult life to live, into groups. And in doing that, realized that they needed, rules to live by. And the rule that seemed to stick and continues to stick to this day is what's called the rule of Saint Benedict. And all really monastic orders, monks and nuns, adhere to, in terms of varying degrees, this rule. There's a set of rules about how to behave, when to speak, how to pray, and so on. And the group that I went to live with, the Trappists, or the Order of Cistercians of the Strict Observance, are strict observers of this rule. They're very kind of traditional in their approach to the rule. And that emerged out of a desire to shift away from what in the 10th century was becoming a very worldly way of engaging in monastic life. The Benedictines were engaged in a lot of commerce. They were running these large farms. They had lots of land holdings. They were involved in politics, and people like Saint Bernard, who started the Cistercian order, really felt that that was too far away from the sort of pure idea of this contemplative, mystical life that is monastic life. And so he and a group broke from Benedictines, and then there was a later split even within the Cistercians, which led to the formation of the Trappists. So I was going to go live with the Trappists. The Trappists live what's called a cloistered life. That is, that they live within monasteries that they commit to for their lifetime, not just to a group, but to a community living in a particular place. And many monastics will spend, years sometimes without leaving the monastic space. And right, the monastery sits on a property, this beautiful 500-acre property in western Massachusetts that used to be an old dairy farm. And the experience of being in that space reminded me a lot of like a mandala, right? Where you've got this enclosure, this sort of forest that surrounds the property of the monastery, that encloses that space and separates it from the world kind of physically and spiritually. And then the monastery itself, the structure encapsulates the community, and the community then is sheltered sort of within that space, and then the community facilitates the development of the individual, and it's from the individual that this idea of divine love is expressed out into the world through prayer and through action within the community. And so I entered into this space where I was going to go, and I was going to essentially stay on this property, about 150 acres in sort of the area that I stayed in, with the same, several dozen individuals that live in the monastery and not really leave at all. And what happens, I want to talk about in a bit, what happens when you get into a space and you really shrink your universe, what happens to it, and what I noticed. But what you see in a space like that, where you live through this monastic day, which is punctuated by the liturgy, monastics also live by a liturgical structure with work and some private activity built into it. But the liturgy is built around this sort of annual cycle, a daily cycle that's called the Liturgy of the Hours, or the Divine Office. And all monastics pray, all religious within the Christian faith pray within the structure of what's called the Liturgy of the Hours on a daily basis. So everybody around the world is praying the same set of prayers, and there are these 7 hours throughout the day, plus the celebration of the Eucharist at Mass. That is the day. And the fascinating thing about this kind of cycle, the sort of rhythm of the divine office, is that because there's a Trappist monastery in all time zones around the world, that at any given moment there is somebody praying the same prayers that you were praying the hour before, like the divine office. There's always somebody praying, so it kind of turns the world into this enormous sort of prayer wheel. That at any point in time there is a group of people that are intently engaged in prayers for love towards the world. And I was participating in that. I became a part of that intimately for the period of time I was there at the monastery. I think thinking about rhythms is also important, because when we think about, mostly we live in kind of a linear time scale where we have a present where we spend a little bit of time, usually if it's good, we're like maybe more focused on the moment. Then we have a past that we're constantly like reassessing and rehashing and trying to kind of reinterpret. And then we have this future that we're trying to project ourselves out into, where we are, trying to kind of plan everything as best we can, and hopefully it works out, and it usually doesn't. What do you do? And we kind of move through time in the past and in the future, and maybe not so much in the present. And what monastic life does is it pulls you out of that linear space and places you into this cycle of existence, the cycle of being. And like a rhythm, right, it's circular, right? When we learn a rhythm initially, we have to count it off and kind of figure it out. But once we know it, it like grabs us, right? Like the way a dance can, or the way kind of getting into music can, that, you know, we time no longer is important. What matters is the rhythm itself, and then what emanates from it. We kind of dance things out. The Spirit moves through us, and we experience the world in a very different way. And the monastic life is about facilitating that experience. So the monastic day starts at 3 a.m. and by 3:30, you know, I would get up, I would dress, I would put on this black hoodie that they were kind enough to send me home with as a reminder of my experience. I didn't get a habit because I'm not a professed monk. I didn't give up all of my worldly possessions just temporarily while I was staying there. But to remind me of the simplicity of monastic life and the idea of poverty and humility that Christ represents, you know, I would wear this to chapel, you know, daily. So it's a reminder of my connection to that community. So I would dress, I would go to the chapel, you know, in the dark, and we would begin with the vigil, which is the first office. And when you hear the word vigil, you know, I think of like this idea of, right, wait, you're waiting for something. This idea of waiting, perhaps Jesus' return in the third incarnation at the end of time. The idea, you know, that you know, be vigilant. You know, Christ is going to return when you least expect it. So always be ready, as it says in the Bible. And so, you know, there's that idea the vigil is waiting for that. But what the vigil really is, what I came to understand engaging in that ritual over and over again, which is the chanting of the Psalms back and forth, this kind of setting this contemplative vigilance for the day, and realizing what that ritual really meant is not about waiting for something external to arrive, but an internal preparation of the soul to act out the day that is yet to come, that is about to be there in front of you. And, you know, asking myself, am I going to be, you know, Brother Aaron, who is like frustrated and tired and, you know, maybe doesn't want to do all the jobs I got to do today? Or do I want to be Brother Aaron who wants to engage as fully as I can out of compassion and love within the community? And so what I was trying to do in that space, and what I think the vigil is really about, is that preparation of the soul for how you're going to live, right? And that intention being set in that space kind of early in the quiet hours of the morning. Following from the vigil from 4 to 6:30 is this kind of open time where you engage in prayer and contemplation, or Lectio Divina in the morning, which is this sort of very slow, close, contemplative reading of a text, a meditative activity that goes way back in monastic traditions. And you could either stay in the chapel quietly there in the dark, or you could go back to your cell, which is your room. And so I would often go back to my cell, and I would, you know, meditate, pray, write. Sometimes I would fall back asleep if I was really tired. But the cell is an interesting space, because the cell is this like private, it's really your only private space in a monastery. When you give up everything, you don't really own anything. You don't own your clothes on your back, you don't own any stuff. Really the only thing you have is this space, right? Your room. And, you know, there are very strict rules about who can enter a monk's cell and under what circumstances, to maintain privacy and the sanctity of that space. And, you know, the room itself is just a room. It's like a little 10 by 10, you know, room. And they used to be even smaller than that. But, you know, it's a bed, a table, desk, a little closet, some pegs to hang my clothes on, because I realized you don't really need all that much in a monastery. It's like clothes for work and clothes for church, and that's about it, because you're either at work or in church, or maybe taking a walk. So I had, you know, a couple shirts, a couple pairs of pants, and a coat. And I tried to keep it as clean as I could because, mess can get out of hand in a place like that really quickly, but also because it's like when you're in a space that small, it's like a reflection of your inner space, your mind. And keeping it clean and ordered was a way to kind of keep myself, I guess, cleaned and ordered. And when you're in that space privately and you eliminate the distractions that are so common in the world, the things that we kind of put out here for ourselves to, be distracted by, our activities, our work, what we want to project out into the world as to sort of who we are and what we are and what we represent, and how we dress and how we want to be perceived. When you strip all that away, what you're left with is what's inside, and it's that inner looking that I was really doing. I was really engaged in that space, and you come face to face with a lot of things that either would surprise me, or maybe things that I didn't want to admit but had to face about myself, and saying, okay, well, there's no hiding from it, right? Sort of in that space. So there's this old monastic saying, right? Go into your cell or stay in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. And in a sense, that's true, right? Because your cell is your inner space. Like, we're always looking outside ourselves for answers, when the answers are inside. I mean, they're not out here. They're internal, like, to us, right? Like, wherever we go, we're always taking ourselves with us. There we are, right? We take ourselves with us. It's like, if you want to understand, or you want to identify kind of what is good, bad, or going on with your life, you have to look inwards, right? And the interior space is so convoluted or so distorted, or covered up in the outside world, as opposed to it is in a monastery. So I would spend a lot of time in that space exploring that inner territory. At 6, the bell would ring again, and we would go to lauds, which is the second hour of the day, more psalms, chanting and prayer, followed by the Mass, the celebration of the Eucharist. And again, repeating the Eucharist over and over again, and the Eucharist being this kind of very important aspect of the Catholic faith, and one of the great mysteries of the Church. The idea of what the celebration of this idea from kind of this segment in Christ's life, right, from the Last Supper acted out through the Passion and the Resurrection, right, sort of occurs for all Catholics on a weekly basis in this ritual. And if you're in a monastic setting, it's every day, right, because that happens every single day, except for Good Friday. And coming to understand this idea of the Eucharist as being an admonition to not just be like Christ, but to look at this divine individual who is forgiving and compassionate and capable of healing, and an idea that's rooted in humility and simplicity and love, is not just to think about like what he would do, but like to literally like imbibe internally, to take in and assimilate fully this idea of being a divine individual, and trying your best to do so, because that's really all we can do. And that in doing so, we also have to sacrifice all these aspects of self and of our identity that we have to let go of to be able to freely do that. Sort of all the things that get in the way of our ability to love and connect with one another, we have to sacrifice those. And in a sense, kind of let that self die to the world so we can then be something greater, right? That we can enter into this eternal space, the kind of mystical space out of time. Those are some of the things that came up for me in that kind of repeated rhythmic process. Following from Mass, I would usually go and have a quick breakfast, like tea and toast. There's not really a meal in the morning, you just kind of have a snack. And then I would go to the gym and do a little exercise, maybe go for a jog, on the property somewhere, as the sun was coming up, in part because I wanted to lose a few pounds, but also because the work is really difficult, and I needed to be in shape to do it, and so I needed to exercise besides just the daily work that I was doing, and that was a really great way to explore the space as well, and kind of be present in the monastery. And afterwards I would get ready for work, so I was at work by about 8:30 or 9, depending on where I was working, what I was doing. And when you're in a monastery and you're the new guy, you get all the best jobs. So I got the heavy lifting and the stacking of boxes, here and there, cleaning bathrooms and scrubbing toilets and showers, and installing storm windows, or clearing up brush outside. Sometimes I would work in the brewery. Just kind of whatever needed to be done. And each Sunday I would just be assigned my work for the week. I would get a little slip of paper, and my place setting would say, here's what I'm doing, my jobs for the days that I'm working and the time slots that I'm working. And the monks at Spencer do a variety of things. There's a rule in the Trappist order that says you must live by the work of your own hands. And to do that, the monks make jam and jelly and preserves, these delicious, we got to enjoy them on Sunday. That was like sort of special feast day thing. We got jam for breakfast on Sunday, these delicious jams. And so I would work there, kind of stacking boxes on pallets for shipment, or inspecting batches kind of coming through the system. They also opened the first Trappist brewery outside of Europe, and that's been in the last 5 years that they've done that, making Spencer beer. And they also make vestments, sort of the clothing that you see a priest wearing, or altar cloths or things like that, are these beautiful ethically sourced fabrics from all over the world, and they sell them all over the place. And so I was involved in packing and shipping for that. And so those were kind of the three main sort of means of supporting the monastery. And then I would and everything else I would do, cooking, cleaning. I worked in the library some, and monastic work is a way of serving the community, but it's also a way of, I think, connecting more with a sense of gratitude, a sense of humility, a feeling of humility, right? Like nothing makes you feel more humble than scrubbing somebody else's toilet or sink. And we often think of that as being the job of someone else, not our own. And when you take on a job like that voluntarily, and within that space, in part it's like to teach you about its value and its necessity, and that it's not something to be judged and assumed as this is a low job, right? Like monastics love low jobs, right? Anything to get low, right? To be more humble and to connect with Christ, right? Christ was, he's like, not like, don't look up here, look down here, look, I'm down here. I'm down here with the lowly. And if you want to get close to that, you engage in those sorts of activities, and in doing so, you recognize that something like this can be a real love letter, right? A real act of kindness and compassion to take the time and effort to do that sort of work. And the other thing about monastic work is that it occurs within a time frame, right? It goes from around we would go from around 8:30 or 9 to 11:45, and so it doesn't matter what you're doing or how fast you do it, because you're going to be working until that time anyway. So there's no need to rush what it is that you're doing. And we live in a world that's like, let me do this thing so I can do the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, right? It's not about sort of creating a space for that work. And so that really kind of changes the mindset about how you engage in what you do, and doing things really to the best of your ability, to be very mindful as you engage in it. And so I would work, and we'd stop at 10 for the hour of terce, which was about 15 minutes. Say a few prayers in the workspace with your brothers, and then go back to work until 11:45. And then from 11:45 to 12:15, I had a little bit of time to get cleaned up, and then be back in the church at 12:15 for the middle hour of the day sext, and then the examine prayer, which is this examination of self about sort of where you've been during the day, and this constant, again, you've got work and prayer already kind of punctuated by these activities, and what one experiences in that space is this sense of reorienting towards this goodness, right? This sort of divine, this divine presence that we, stop what we're doing and, get out of our own heads in a sec, if you're kind of caught up, maybe tired or frustrated or whatever it might be, and directing the attention towards, there's something greater than me that I can orient towards and that I can try and be more like, right? Try and cultivate that more, bring that more into the world. It's very much like in Muslim prayers at the very beginning when, the person praying stops and says Allahu Akbar and raises their hands, in a sense, like lifting this veil of the world away and saying quite literally, God is greater than all of this that is here in front of us now. And being reminded periodically throughout the day of that reality, that real reality, not the reality that we generate for ourselves or that we spend so much time caught in, but that there is something so much greater that we are a part of and that everything emerges out of and is quickened and enlivened by. Following from the middle hour of sext, we would walk to the refectory, which is kind of the dining room, and we would, sit, and we're kind of, set up in these two long rows, and then at the head of the room is the abbot and your kind of seniority, the old eldest monks, some of them have been there since the mid-1950s, and then back, and then I'm at the farthest seat on the opposite side of the room. So there's this hierarchical structure to things, while we're eating in silence this food that has been prepared by the cook and the cook's helper in the morning. And sometimes I would do that job as well. I really loved working in the kitchen. And then after lunch, after we called it dinner, because it was like 9 hours into the day, right, when we're having this meal. And so after we would eat dinner, we would do the dishes. And while there's this hierarchical structure to the monastery, when it came to cleaning up after dinner, everybody had a job, right? So the abbot's even in the kitchen kind of putting food away, leftovers, setting those aside for later, I'm washing dishes, people are scrubbing pots and that kind of thing. And everybody's sort of interacting in that space. And then afterwards, everybody goes, they have like a break until from about 1:10, 1:15 to 2 o'clock, which is called the meridian. You can take a nap or do whatever you kind of want to do. And I would often found I had a hard time during this time of day, which is funny because I found out in my studies while I was there that that's actually like a thing that's been known. Evagrius the Solitary around the year 300 was like writing down that, this noonday period, after the monk has been up and about for, quite a long time is a difficult sort of challenging period of a sense of kind of listlessness or lethargy or confusion or frustration, right? He called it the noonday demon. In the Hebrew scriptures, it's referred to the scourge that lays waste at noon. And it's this time where, you're asking the question, like, why am I doing this? Why am I working so hard? What is the reason behind all of this? Like, what's my motivation? I'm tired and I want to go home. Sometimes that would come up, and that's like a universal, right? And if you think like, that's like 3 o'clock for the average person. If you think about those days at 3 o'clock where you really start to question what you're doing or have difficulty with what you're doing, I think that's a great example. And so sometimes I would go and I would take a walk, or I remember I had a meeting one day. I had injured my back doing a lot of lifting in the preserves, moving boxes over the course of a couple days, and I had kind of thrown my back out, and I was having trouble picking really anything up, or bending over was painful. And this was like 3 weeks into my stay, and I was like, oh man, like am I going to get sent home? Like, do I have to leave? Like, I was kind of in this mindset of, I had entered into this agreement with these men, and, they had allowed me to come and live with them and live their life if I was willing to work. That was sort of the deal. And I was like, yeah, of course I'll do that. And I was like, well, I can't work. And then, so like, am I not worth anything? Right. So it's this kind of condition of worth that we see, all the time in our world, right? We live in this world of kind of opposition and value judgments and conditions of worth and commodification, right, of individuals and of things. And, like, you're not valuable if you can't produce. And it's this dichotomous way of thinking. And it's not like that in a monastery. Monasteries are built around love and union. I mean, that's the divine idea. And I was like all day thinking before this meeting, because I had to go talk with Father Luke, the novice master, and tell him what was going on. And I was like afraid of what was going to happen. Am I going to get fired from being a monk? And when I got in there, I'll never forget what happened. I told him what was going on, and the way he responded was it was foreign, right? Compared to like what one would experience out here. Like, he looks at me and he says, we're really sorry we had you do the extra shift. Like, we usually don't do that. We're sorry that you hurt yourself, and we'll take care of you. And there are many ways to serve the community. And all the conversation that had been going on in my brain, like leading up to that discussion, was passing through the lens of the outside world, of all these sort of ideas of separation and value, and all my responses had been, passing through that lens as well. Like, what was going to happen, and what would he say, what would I, whatever, these sort of preparatory kind of conversations in my head. And he, with this one act of unconditional kindness and love, he just shattered it. And that was it. There was no discussion to have. It was simply, we're sorry, we will take care of you, and there are so many ways that you can serve. And I realized I had carried all that into this space with me from the outside into this divine space. And it, in that moment, in many ways, it lifted, right? It disappeared. It was this weight that, it was like that stuff, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in that space. It doesn't matter in the space out here. At least it shouldn't. And we should find ways to make it not, but at least there it didn't matter. And I'll never forget that. That was a really important moment. It was a powerful moment for me. So the afternoon, following kind of this early afternoon sort of break, we move into kind of later part of the day. At 2:00, there's another short office called Known, and then following from that is afternoon work from about 2:15 to 4 p.m. And in that space, a lot of times I was in the kitchen. One of the brothers fell and injured his leg, one of the cooks, and Father Luke recommended me to help because I had told him something that I had enjoyed cooking, I think, in a conversation we were having. He's like, well, I recommended you to be the new supper cook while Brother Patrick is healing. And I looked at him, I was like, you want me to cook for 40 people? I was really nervous, and he just looked at me and was like, I have faith in you. This is how he responded. And initially I was really nervous about it, was I gonna like accidentally make somebody sick, or were they gonna like my cooking, or, and it was all this ego stuff going on, like all boiling down to like, oh, like, are they gonna like me, right? Am I gonna be approved of, right? And it's all sort of within this sort of idea of food. And pretty quickly I was able to let go of that, and I was able to spend this time in the kitchen really engaging with the preparation of meals and the preparing of food. And I love being in the kitchen. The kitchen in a monastery is an interesting place because it's kind of like this neutral zone, right? Like people are kind of in and out all day. You know, somebody comes in for a cup of coffee or a cookie, or, you know, take a break. And, you know, I loved spending time in the kitchen because, you know, it was this kind of like free and open space. And Brother Jude, who has been running the kitchen for a long time, he's fond of saying, you know, back in the, you know, I think it was the early 90s, the former cook was getting kind of old, and the abbot had asked him, hey, can you temporarily take over the kitchen? And Jude didn't really want to do it. And he's like, no, it's temporary. And so Jude agrees, because you do. I mean, you're obedient to your superiors in this space. And he's like, and then 30 years went by. And that's kind of how time goes at a monastery. And Jude loved to cook, and I loved cooking with Jude, and we had a lot of fun doing it and sharing stories. You know, like, you know, we didn't talk a lot about the outside world. We talked about, you know, experiences. We talked about our families. We talked about the kind of things that you talk about with your own family, like stories that matter, that make up our lives. And being in that space, kind of preparing meals, whether I was with Jude or Patrick or Micah or any of the other brothers that would be cooking at times, or if I was by myself, it became this very like meditative process. In part, I liked it because I think it gave me some freedom of choice in a place where you don't have a lot of freedom of choice in terms of what you're doing, but I could decide kind of what to cook, and I could, you know, share that with this family that I was a part of. But I got to thinking a lot about food and this idea of, like, you know, just the magic that is food and cooking, right? You know, you think about what goes into a tomato, and, like, you know, some of these things were things that I had literally dug out of the ground, like potatoes and things that we were preparing in the kitchen, right? And so, you know, you're going from being in this space to, you know, preparing this food and seeing all the energy, the sun, the moon, the water, the earth, the biome in the ground, you know, all of that, you know, the person who picks it, and, you know, the preparation process, and then you eat it and it fuels you and it fuels the people around you, was so, you know, just to be like I was just aware, I was very acutely aware of participating in that process. And the process of cooking too is important. There's one of the most important Soto Zen Buddhist texts out there is called Instructions to the Tenzo, and it's the instructions to the cook about how to run a kitchen. And what it's really about is about how to be, you know, how to live within this kind of metaphorical framework of being a cook. And so that kind of food cook connection. I mean, the cook's the one job that you don't get Sundays off. Everybody gets Sundays off, except for who's cooking meals. You still got to cook and nourish the community. So I cooked a lot, thanks to my wife and my family for sending me recipes and, you know, giving me ideas. And some of my Sunday internet time, I would look up recipes for the coming week. After afternoon work, from 4 till about 5:40, so that's the longest period of unstructured free time during the day. And so during that period, and then on Sundays when there weren't any work periods, it was our rest day, I would really explore outside. I would walk, I would, you know, check out the woods, I would, you know, just experience the space, right? Like, you know, sunrise, sunset, you know, all that sort of stuff, just being in nature as much as I could be. I felt that was the place that I felt closest to divinity, was in the space. And the monastery is on a beautiful patch of land in Massachusetts. And being in this kind of, in the small space, like I said, when you shrink your universe, it gets so much bigger. You see things in a whole new kind of way, right? Like we normally, like, we maybe don't even think about our space, or we move through space, right? Like we're, you know, we have like our GPS devices, right? And like that, you could walk around all day and not even look at the world. You could just look at your device and follow the little the little dot, right? You're the center of the universe, and the universe is kind of moving or scrolling past you along this like blue line, and it's just like gray, green, whatever. It's just simplified in this way, and like the world is so much more rich than that. And I think we can easily forget that. When I was, in this kind of small space, like every single day, walking past the same trees and the same animals, and seeing the day change, and the rhythm of the day, and the sunrise and the sunset, and the changing weather. What you find is like the one thing that's really constantly shifting drastically is you. I'm the thing that's not constant in this space. Like everything else is moving on a much different kind of time scale. And so there was this moving through the day and through the season. So I would notice things like I could tell, when I went outside, okay, today the sun's going to set over there, it's going to rise over here, or how long it's going to take those rain clouds to get here based on this sort of movement. And so there's like this, my eyes were getting soft, and in a sense I was experiencing these different kinds of topographies, right? These topographies of air, topographies of light, of sound, of movement, right? Of these daily cycles, weekly cycles, seasonal cycles, yearly cycles. To live in that place for multiple years, what it would be like to understand or be a part of that movement that is on such a different kind of time frame. But it made me feel so much more intimately connected to the world around me. And I got to see a lot about how, like St. Francis talked so much about, finding God in the animals and in the natural world. And he's absolutely right. He's like, we see this divine complexity in the world around us. And even if somebody's an atheist or agnostic or just not, non-believer, they see that complexity still, and they just call it, maybe they call it by a different name, right? Or maybe they think about it different structurally, but I think fundamentally there's not, that difference is not a real difference. It's a difference that we generate, right? It's a differentiation we make. And so that being in that space, it really changed the way I interacted with it and came to understand it and connect directly with it. At 5:40, you go to Vespers, which is kind of the evening office. It's a little bit longer. And after Vespers would be another about an hour and a half break, to have time to have a quick supper from like 6 to 6:30. And then oftentimes I would go and meet with my spiritual advisor, Father William Menninger, who was living in the infirmary, which is sort of the kind of hospital that's attached to the monastery. Spencer has an infirmary for its aging monks, and William had been living in Snowmass for many years at the monastery in Aspen. That's a daughter house of St. Joseph's. And he's gotten quite old. He's in his 80s. He's pretty much blind, mostly deaf. He has some trouble getting around, but he's so full of life, and like almost like this sort of childlike excitement about the Spirit and seeing, I see God everywhere. I remember he would say to me, and the older I get, I see God. The more I see God everywhere, and the more I connect with the Spirit, and the more I recognize, the incarnation as occurring constantly and unfolding right in front of us in the world, if we're only just willing to look at it. And so I would spend these evenings with William. He's the sort of world's foremost authority on this book called The Cloud of Unknowing, which is this text on basically on monastic life, right? How do you connect with the divine presence that's like just so beyond the intellect? And the answer is it's on the other side of this cloud of unknowing. You have to let go of so much that grounds you and attaches you in the world to be present with something like that. And you must lift up your heart with a gentle stirring. right? And part of it is, what does that mean, and what does it mean to lift, up your heart? Like, it's not up, like there isn't an up in terms of divine presence, like it's non-directional, right? But it's this opening up of oneself towards something. And so we did this very slow reading of the Cloud of Unknowing, and had a number of conversations. We talked about all kinds of stuff. I mean, he would ask as many questions, I think, as he would answer. I would ask him about faith and spirituality and grace and with this sort of letting go, and we would talk about sort of these similarities with other spiritual traditions. And it was in those conversations that things became connected with my interests in Sufism and Buddhism and the Vedic traditions, and just to see the level of connection was so refreshing, as someone who has sort of always struggled, purposefully in some ways struggled with belief, the universality of the divine as not a person someplace, right, or as a human representation, but as the undifferentiated ground that is pregnant with possibility, that is out of which all things emerge and are enlivened by. Like, it's what if God is anything, that is what God is, right? Like Paul Tillich used to say, neither name nor job description, or to say God is, and in pausing, allowing anyone to fill in the blank and say it's nothing like whatever you were just thinking. In fact, not a thing at all. But this space, this formlessness, this emptiness, but not empty. That's that mystical sort of idea or the mystical experience of connecting, with that through, these different means of contemplation, of meditation, for the Cloud of Unknowing, it's what's called apophatic prayer versus the cataphatic, which is like spoken kind of vocal prayer, and that the life of prayer is really balancing these two. That, like, you can't have, a healthy prayer life or spiritual life if you're only just talking to the divine, but also that you are simply opening up and loving and connecting in this unifying way with the divine through this apophatic process. And so there's this dialectical, right, process of words as being important, but also words as being kind of useless, right, or unnecessary, or contemplation and stillness, or action and doing, and both are necessary, right, to lead a full and rich life. And those were the kinds of things we would talk about, and it was a wonderful experience to share with him. Following those meetings would be the last hour of the day. That's the office of Compline, which is sort of the monastic goodnight prayer. It's sung in the dark with one candle lit over top of the word, and we would sing it in harmony every other night. It's the one time you use harmony. Everything else is a kind of a Gregorian sort of structure musically. And it was in those spaces with my brothers, kind of calling out into the dark, and silence being this return answer that we are receiving. The feeling of that, that not knowing, that unknowing of self, that kind of being this sort of one unit in union. And being ready to go to bed at 8:00 and get up tomorrow morning at 3 and do it again. And in that space, struggling with all those things that one struggle with, of what's there's never, you have moments, right, where you experience a divine presence that may be, something beautiful or something, that affects you profoundly, and maybe you have a deep mystical experience that completely dissolves your ego and allows you to connect directly with that ground of being. But a lot of times it's just quiet and uncertainty and silence, and the idea of why does one do this? And the answer is that what you experience, like what comes out of you, what emanates from you, what made me sing those songs and chant the Psalms and be in that space, like that is the response. That is the divine calling back to us, through us, into the world. And it does make, I suppose, some degree of sense if you think about it as, it's not, there's not an external force, right? It's everything. It's within everything. It's this fundamental of being. It's very difficult to talk about because, like I've said, being in a monastery, right? It's an enacted life, and you embody it. It's not an intellectual exercise. Intellect is insufficient for the amount of energy required to live and work and exist in a space like that. The community is so loving and supportive, that certainly helps, but you can't just think your way through it. It's something you have to feel your way through. And the experience of being there really, it taught me that, right? It taught me that, that there are things sometimes that you just need to do, and that you in some ways have to let go of what you want and what you desire and enter into that stream of being, enter into that rhythm and allow the rhythm to move you. And in doing that, I fell in love with that experience. I fell in love with these men. These beautiful old, most of them are 70 years old or more. And, what happens to you when you exist in a space like that day in and day out for years is this grace has an effect on you, on your person, right? Like what you exude. And I am forever grateful for them opening their world up to me and making me a part of it, and allowing me to return back there whenever I want, and hopefully as soon as I can, to reconnect with that, but also to bring that out into the world, to enact that, in the world in the same way that they do what they do for the world. It's easy to look at monastic life and say it's this separation from the world, right? It's not, like, how is it helping the world? And the answer is that, like, it is fundamentally necessary. If you understand the underlying interconnectedness of all things, it becomes a necessary act that somebody engages in for us. It's for some people and not for others. Some are drawn to the contemplative life, some are drawn to the life of action, but we need both in both spaces. So being in that space was profoundly powerful and life-changing, for me. And I hope, if you are curious about it, that you find a way to explore it more deeply, or to explore the idea of contemplation, balancing action in your own life in whatever way you're capable of. because it's not about making you a better person, it's about making the world better through you, about allowing that rhythm, that process to move through you, that cycle that is occurring to move through you. So thanks.